The separation of powers is what comprises the UK Constitution, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. In this video, we're going to talk about the responsibilities of each of these institutions and also consider how they fit into the constitutional system. Now, I'm Lewis from the Thinking Bubble, and today we're talking about the separation of powers, or more specifically, what is the separation of powers? We're first going to start off with the legislative branch. The role of the legislator, as you guessed, is to represent the views of the people and to make legislation. In the UK, the primary responsibility is for enacting legislation rests with Parliament, also known as Westminster. However, this picture is a little bit more complex, as there are other legislators such as the Scottish Parliament that also exercise legislative power. Parliament, or the legislator, also have the basic responsibility for holding the executive to account. The second branch is the judiciary. It is exactly what you would expect. It is the system of courts and tribunals that interpret the law and legal disputes. The court system in the UK contains many different types of courts and tribunals, ranging from county courts to high courts to the Supreme Court at its apex. And finally, there is the executive, or the administrative branch, better known as the government. The government, as you may have guessed it, is responsible for making and implementing public policy. The executive branch exists and operates at many different levels. The central government consists of departments of state like the Home Office, the Treasury, and so on. It also includes the cabinet. Now, these departments and the cabinet are all under the leadership of the Prime Minister. Previously, there was an even higher tier of government from the European Union. But since Brexit is a thing, that no longer applies. Now, you may have questions on this already, and there are many specific issues in relating to individual institutions that we need to address at some point. An answer to your specific question can be chalked up to this very simple level of thinking. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve. For example, a dictator would design a system that would enable him to do whatever he wished with little interference whatsoever. The dictator would not want to be troubled by an independent judiciary to tell him that the law prevented him from doing certain things. Thankfully, most systems of government, at least formally, are not designed in such a way. There is a broad consensus of government that should be organised according to the doctrine of separation of powers. So, as stated before, there are three distinct branches. However, beyond this rudimentary outline, there is no uniform way as to how these relationships between these branches should interact. A stricter formation would require that no branch should be able to exercise power over another, and no branch should be able to exercise the powers of another branch. For example, the judiciary shouldn't be able to make laws because that's the executive's job. The executive shouldn't be interpreting the law. And in addition to that, no person should be a member of more than one branch. So why embrace the separation of powers? Well, since there are obvious flaws with having three strict, distinct branches, it can still have its benefits. Even if it's not a separate legislator or a separate executive or a separate judiciary, many of the functions that would in most countries be carried out by these three institutions would still be performed. Laws would have to be made, laws would have to be implemented, and they would have to be interpreted upon. This obviously assumes that the country concerned is governed in a way that is based on some form of law rather than brute force. In an absence of these distinct institutions, therefore, it would ultimately fall into a single institution, leading to a government to perform all such functions. The separation of powers seeks to provide a model of government in which the risk of abuse of power are reduced, and it does so by advocating a constitutional architecture in which power is divided rather than concentrated in one institution. Now, of course, it doesn't actually guarantee that power will not be abused, but all three branches must be prepared to collude in the abuse of power. But it certainly makes for abuse of power to be far less likely. As James Madison describes, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Of course, there are two objectives: the prevention of tyranny and the facilitation of socially useful conduct by a government, and these two things are not mutually exclusive. It is, however, desirable to strike a balance between a government that is so powerful that it is liable to act in tyranny, and one that is so weak that it is unable to do anything useful. Both views fit the notion of the fact that separation of powers is a means to an end. Overall, the separation of powers is a methodology. It is a way of organizing things to secure or prevent a particular outcome. It is a methodology that works hand in hand with democracy. Of course, it is possible to conceive other constitutional systems that are democratic, which entail no separation of powers or subscribe to the separation of powers, but which embody no recognizable form of democracy. There's a scale here. The separation of powers and democracy, they're often found together. They may be mutually reinforcing. Democracy may assist the attaining goals such as prevention of abuse of power. On the other hand, the separation of power is liable to bolster democracy by requiring the legislative function to be performed by the legislator specifically. For that concludes this part of the separation of powers. The next video will be discussing the drawbacks. But I leave you with one question. What do you think of the separation of powers?